Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Today is May 11th, and this is the next reading on the Civil War. It's called War Affects Society. This reading that we're going to be looking at today is going to be looking at how is the war affecting people who are not soldiers, right? What's going on? And we have a lot of new vocabulary. If everyone could please say Copperhead. A copperhead was like a derogatory term given to a northerner who opposed the war, basically like war protesters, right? Conscription. This is conscription laws were laws that forced men to fight in war. Oftentimes, people refer or think of them as draft laws. It drafts or conscripts people into fighting in war against their will. The other term we care about in here is income tax, which is a tax on their earnings. The war became so costly that they had to enact an income tax, that is, taxing the income that people make. And today, we all pay income tax. Back in the Civil War, this was a new thing. And the last term here is Clara Barton. She was a woman who organized relief agencies to help soldiers who were wounded in war, which she later founded the organization that we today know as the Red Cross. So in the reading here, it says you're going to learn how war caused social and economic changes in the North and South. So this reading is really about how does the war affect people outside of the battles and the soldiers, right? One of the first things I want to talk about here is that people started fighting about the war continuing. And the fact that there were actually war protesters, mostly in the north, but in the south to a little bit of degree, but in a lot of urban areas like New York, Boston, Philadelphia, these large cities, people started to protest against this war. They were seeing the death toll increase, they saw their family members dying, and people wanted an end. These people, of course, became known as copperheads in the sense that, like a copperhead snake, they were poisonous. You can see in this political cartoon, these copperheads or war protesters are poisonous, and you can see here Lady Liberty defending the Union. And as a result, Lincoln actually had many of these war protesters arrested. And this is kind of not, doesn't bode well for Lincoln in terms of his legacy, but he suspended habeas corpus, which is the right to defend yourself in court. And if you think about it, this is the United States. You have the right to defend yourself in court. Constitution, the amendments to the Constitution give you the right to speak out against things that the government does. You have the right to assemble with others and protest peacefully. You have the right to a trial. And Lincoln actually suspended this and immediately had protesters arrested, which is unconstitutional. Then it talks here about draft laws. So drafting is, of course, forcing people into war. Both sides of this war were losing soldiers on such a large level that they didn't have any more people in ranks. So they started conscripting or forcing people to fight. Now, part of what made this a big problem was that, as I'm going to show you guys here in just a moment, is that these draft laws or conscription laws were not very equal. You could avoid conscription in many cases for several $100s. Think about $300, you could avoid conscription. So if you had $300, which at that time was a lot of money, you could avoid going to war. You could pay for someone to substitute you. So this essentially meant that the rich or the well-off could avoid going to war, and the poor were going to be forced to fight it. This turned into mass-scale riots. Cities all over the North had riots where people refused to go, where there was armed conflict. Now, the most traumatic of these was the New York draft riots in New York City. Immigrants and other groups who were violently opposed to these draft laws, and they essentially burned New York City to the ground in about a 3-day period. The war, the draft riots were so bad they targeted the rich, and so they burned the homes of the wealthy and the rich because they could avoid the draft, of course, with conscription fees. And they also attacked African Americans. So many free African Americans in New York City were the victims of violence and lynching because many of these writers blame them for the reason for the war taking place. In the reading, it also talks about how the economy of the South kind of was starting to hurt as a result of this, how there was inflation. It talks about the North and about how they were losing money on industries and production. And that's a whole nother piece there that I'm not really going to go over in a lot of detail. Here it talks about women aiding in the war effort. And it talks about how women did a lot during the Civil War. Women were nurses on the battlefield. They tended to the wounded. One of the most famous of this, of course, was a woman named Clara Barton. And Clara Barton founded what would become the Red Cross. It was a relief agency for people who are displaced from their home. But in the Civil War, there was many men who were, as many died, twice as many were wounded. And it really was the care of these women in the Civil War, like Clara Barton, whom kind of helped these men through the recuperation of being wounded in the battlefields. The last piece here is a short 2-paragraph piece here that talks about prison camps. So not every man in war died on the battlefield. Many men in the North and the South were captured as prisoners. And when you're captured more as a prisoner, you're often put into a prison camp. And there were these prison camps in both the North and the South, and especially some of the ones in the South. And one of the ones it talks about here was one called Andersonville. And these prison camps, ladies and gentlemen, were basically death camps. And these were camps that kept men who were prisoners of war. They weren't fed very well. They didn't have access to a lot of things. In some cases, as you can see here, this giant prison camp in Georgia, these men didn't even have shelter in some cases. They were just like lying out in the sun and the rain and the elements. And sometimes there were poems written by these men about having to eat the dirt because there was no food to eat and looking for worms. When they liberated these prison camps, many of these men were deformed. They were malnourished. Many of them died. Thousands of them died in these prison camps. This is an actual photograph of a man who is a survivor, barely, of a prison camp. And there were thousands of men like this. And so it's kind of horrific to think that these prison camps, it's one thing to shoot each other, kill each other on a battlefield, but the way that these people kind of treat each other in the prison camps was oftentimes worse. So, ladies and gentlemen, that is the reading. If you have any questions about it, please email me. Take care and have a good day.